In the shadowy corners of history, there lies a dark chapter, a time when death swept across the world like a storm, leaving fear and devastation in its wake. The Black Death, a silent and invisible killer, claimed millions of lives, spreading terror and confusion across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But what exactly caused this nightmarish plague? Why did it vanish and then return again, leaving behind a legacy of mystery, superstition, and horror? Join us as we uncover the haunting story of the Black Death, a catastrophe that forever changed the course of human history and left a trail of dark secrets still whispered about to this day. It was the year 1347 when the first whispers of a deadly disease began to spread. Stories trickled in from distant lands, tales of ships arriving in European harbors filled not with goods, but with the dead and dying. The sailors' bodies were covered in black, festering sores, their faces twisted in agony. These ships were known as the Death Ships, and their arrival marked the beginning of a pandemic that would ravage the world for the next 4 years. But where did this terrible plague come from? To this day, the true origins of the Black Death remain shrouded in mystery. Many believe it started in the East, in the Mongol Empire, where trade routes carried goods and disease between continents. Some say it was the wrath of God, punishment for humanity's sins. Others claimed it was the work of witches or malevolent spirits sent to punish mankind. But the truth was far more terrifying. It was a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas, which in turn were spread by rats. These rats, with their unseen cargo, traveled on merchant ships, spreading the plague like wildfire. Yet, the people of the 14th century had no understanding of germs or bacteria. All they knew was that death was all around them, coming without warning, and no one was safe. Imagine waking up one morning to find a painful lump on your neck or under your arm. It swells rapidly, turning black, leaking pus, and within hours, you're overtaken by fever, chills, and a crushing sense of doom. These swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, were the first sign that the plague had taken hold. They would appear in the neck, groin, or armpits, and within a day or two, the victim would be covered in black spots, an ominous mark of death. But the horror didn't end there. As the disease progressed, victims would suffer from severe fever, delirium, vomiting, and bleeding from the nose and mouth. Some died within days, while others lingered in unimaginable pain. There was no cure, no escape. The plague didn't discriminate between rich or poor, young or old. Entire families, entire villages were wiped out in a matter of days. The dead piled up in the streets, and soon there were too many bodies to bury. For the survivors, the stench of decay filled the air, and the sounds of wailing and crying became a constant backdrop to their lives. The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was the embodiment of fear and suffering. And as the death toll rose, so too did the desperation of those who remained. In a world without scientific understanding, fear gave rise to superstition. People desperately sought answers. Why was this happening? Who was to blame? Some believed the plague was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for the sins of mankind. Religious processions filled the streets as people begged for forgiveness. Flagellants, individuals who whipped themselves to atone for humanity's sins, marched from town to town, hoping their suffering would spare them from the wrath of the plague. Others, however, turned to darker explanations. They accused witches of casting spells to spread the disease, or blamed Jewish communities for poisoning wells. This paranoia led to widespread persecution and violence, as fear turned neighbors against each other. The plague brought out the worst in humanity. Families abandoned their loved ones, and towns turned into ghost towns as people fled in search of safety. But there was no safety to be found. The Black Death traveled with them. As the bodies piled up, burying the dead became a monumental task. In many towns, there were simply too many corpses to handle, and so mass graves were dug, huge pits where the dead were dumped, often without ceremony or prayer. These plague pits became a haunting reminder of the scale of the disaster. Thousands of bodies buried together, without names, without identities, just anonymous victims of a faceless killer. But even in death, the plague left its mark on culture and art. A macabre image began to appear across Europe, the Dance of Death. This eerie depiction showed skeletons leading people of all walks of life, from kings to peasants, in a grim procession to the grave. The message was clear: death comes for everyone, and no one can escape its grasp. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Black Death began to fade. By 1351, the worst of the pandemic was over, though it would return in smaller waves over the next few centuries. But why did it disappear? What caused the plague to suddenly vanish, only to return again later in history? To this day, historians and scientists are still trying to piece together the mystery. Some believe it was due to changes in climate or improvements in public health practices, while others speculate that the plague had simply run its course. Yet, the disappearance of the Black Death left behind an air of mystery. Had it been defeated, or was it simply lying in wait, ready to strike again? The Black Death left deep scars on the world, scars that can still be felt today. In the wake of the plague, Europe was forever changed. The social order was upended, as the massive loss of life created labor shortages that empowered the working class. Feudalism began to crumble, and the seeds of the Renaissance were sown. But the emotional and psychological toll was just as great. The fear of death and disease left an indelible mark on the human psyche, and the superstitions and rituals born from the plague era continue to linger in our culture. From the eerie images of the Grim Reaper to the enduring fascination with plagues and pandemics, the shadow of the Black Death still looms over us. The Black Death was not just tragedy. It was a story of horror, of humanity's struggle against an invisible enemy, and of the mysteries that still remain unsolved. It reminds us of the fragility of life and the dark forces that can rise unexpectedly from the shadows. And though the plague may be gone, the fear it inspired lives on. Thank you for joining us in this journey through one of the darkest chapters of human history. If you enjoyed this exploration into the Black Death, don't forget to subscribe to the Dark Files for more chilling tales of real horror, unsolved mysteries, and paranormal events. Until next time, remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved.